Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and having looked at food supplies for Britain and France, I want to do the same for Germany and Austria-Hungary, and it was a very different story for the Central Powers. The German government might have had its Schlieffen Plan, much good it did them, but it had no economic plans for a long war. And although Germany produced a lot of its food, before the war it imported about 30% of what it ate. Not only that, it imported much of the fodder needed for livestock and the nitrates that were used in fertilizer. Now, German agriculture was a mixture of large estates and some 4 million small farms. Many of these small farms were farmed by peasants, who grew food partly for their own consumption, and when war came, they unexpectedly retreated into subsistence farming. Women took over the running of many farms, but they faced an additional handicap when the horses used for the heavy work around the farm were requisitioned for the war effort. And so, with a highly effective blockade by the British Navy, Germany always struggled to meet the shortfalls. Bread was rationed as early as January 1915. In 1916, further goods were rationed. Potatoes in April, butter and sugar in May, meat in June, eggs, milk and fats in November. To control supplies, the government also imposed restrictions so that no fats could be sold on a Monday, no meat on Tuesdays and Fridays, and no flour at weekends. And though these goods might be rationed, they still might not be affordable, nor even available, so that substitutes were used for meat and for making bread. To save grain, the government also ordered the slaughter of 1 million pigs in 1915, about a third of their total number. However, in the long term, this led to less vegetables being produced, as it destroyed a valuable source of manure. As a consequence of the shortages, of course, prices rose, doubling by 1916. This led to a black market that by 1918 was the source of 1/3 of total food supplies, according to some estimates. Industrialists buying up food for their workers accounted for much of it. So that by 1917, most Germans were eating around 1,000 calories a day, when the recommended intake today is 2,000 calories for women and 2,500 for men. The winter of 1916-1917 was known as the turnip winter, as with the failure of the potato crop, it became just about the only thing available. Even eggs were in short supply, and so expensive that they were even hard to afford for the middle classes. Both cats and dogs were being eaten by this point. The government ordered food kitchens to be opened in the larger towns and cities, and by early 1917 almost 500 towns and cities had a total of more than 2,200 public kitchens. In Hamburg in 1917, for example, 20% of the population were taking a meal from soup kitchens. The lack of adequate food supplies in Germany not only led in 1915 to the first strikes and riots, but to many deaths. In 1915, just over 88,000 deaths had been attributed to the British blockade. This rose to over 120,000 in 1916, when there were food riots in more than 30 German cities. At the end of June 1916, there was a 3-day strike with 55,000 German workers taking part. It was more of the same in 1917, when 250,000 lives were attributed to the British blockade. In January 1918, 400,000 workers in Berlin went on strike, and they were demanding peace. Within 48 hours, the strikes had spread to 6 other major cities. The German government responded swiftly and firmly. Martial law was declared in Berlin and Hamburg, and striking workers were drafted into the army. In total, German deaths attributable to the blockade, something very hard to establish with certainty, could have been somewhere around 425,000. Germans died of malnutrition, and it is always the young and elderly who are affected first. Deaths caused by tuberculosis, typhoid, both rose. Dysentery was another problem, and a growing number of children had rickets. No wonder Germans referred to the blockade as the hunger blockade. Austria-Hungary also suffered from food shortages. Indeed, most historians conclude that food shortages were the key factor in the defeat of Austria, a factor exacerbated by the actions of the Hungarian government. Before 1914, Austria-Hungary was self-sufficient in grain, but on military advice that the war would be a short one, no plans had been made for the stockpiling of foodstuffs. This was a fatal error. Then, as the war went on, key grain-growing areas of the empire were lost, notably Galicia, so that the grain produced in the empire dropped from 9 million tons in 1914 to just 3 million by 1917. The shortages led to rationing, flour and bread as early as 1915. But the ration card of a worker in heavy industry may have declared that he was entitled to just under 1,300 calories per day, but he was consuming on average less than half that. As the war went on, refugees had to be fed, and harvests failed. Hungary refused Austrian requests for food, while expected supplies from defeated Romania and Ukraine didn't materialise, and requisitioning by the army alienated peasants everywhere. A joint food committee was set up in February 1917, but by 1918 troops and civilians alike were starving and simply wanted the war to end. There had been food riots in Vienna as early as 1915, more frequent riots the following year, and more again in the turnip winter of 1916-17. Following a drastic reduction in flour rations in January 1918, there was a massive wave of strikes involving over 100,000 workers in Vienna and roughly 700,000 across the empire. In early 1918, the government was required to recall and keep until the war's end 7 army divisions to ensure order. Nevertheless, protests peaked again in June 1918 when bread rations were halved. Thousands of Viennese, including women and children, marched into surrounding towns to seize food, resulting in violent clashes. Food shortages were a critical factor in Germany's defeat, as well as in the German Revolution at the end of 1918. They were a critical factor in the defeat of Austria-Hungary too. The problems were huge, and though the Entente powers had advantages over the Central powers, they organised more effectively too. So, I hope you found my presentations useful. If that's the case, do please forgive me for asking you again to give them a thumbs up and to sign up to my channel if you haven't already done so. And again, while I'm at it, can I ask you to spread the word and tell your friends about it too? So, having asked my favours, let me thank you so much for listening and wish you the very best of luck in your studies. Cheers.